So I wonder how you feel about the Apostle Paul. Or more precisely, given that I doubt any of us have had the pleasure of his company, I wonder how you feel about his writings. Those probably 7 letters of the New Testament that scholars now broadly agree were actually written by Paul himself. Well, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if I asked who feels somewhere between ambivalent and hostile to those epistles, I suspect it might be a fair number of you. I've heard a lot of people express their frustration or dislike of Paul's writings, including a fair few people in active ministry. The most recent person to share that frustration with me, as she has before on many occasions, was my own dear mum when we stayed with her last Sunday evening. Her church in Bath, St. Stephen's, is currently following a sermon series on the Old Testament. And my mum expressed her delight at a few weeks off from Paul. It's a view that I expect is widely held in congregations up and down the country. So why do people have at best a love-hate relationship with Paul? And why are some people entirely put off by his teachings? Well, many simply feel excluded by the views that he seems to express. I haven't done a survey, but I am pretty sure that most of those who've expressed their dislike of Paul to me have been women. Perhaps rather unsurprising given his pronouncements in 1 Corinthians on the role of women in the church. At least 2 of the 6 so-called clobber verses that have been used to persecute members of the LGBT community come from Paul's letters. And the historic use of parts of Ephesians and Colossians to justify slavery unsurprisingly make Paul's writings really hard to engage with for many people of colour. A few years ago, the Baptist minister and founder of Oasis, Steve Chalk, wrote a book called The Lost Message of Paul, in which he seeks to re-examine and rediscover Paul's writings. Now, Steve is the first to admit that the book doesn't represent his own personal scholarship, but instead it does what he is so good at in expressing 60 years of emerging and very academic Pauline scholarship into attractive and very accessible language. And if you haven't read it already, it's a book that I would highly recommend. Early in the book, Steve addresses how and why Paul's letters are so deeply polarizing. Over the centuries, he argues, the writing of Paul has been weaponized. His words have been used to justify cruelty towards and exclusion of black people, people of colour, women, people of other religions, the wrong sort of Christian people, Catholic, Orthodox or Protestant, depending on your point of view, non-believers and of LGBT people, to name but a few. So it is no surprise that countless Christians, aside from anyone else, feel ambivalent at best towards the apostle and his words. For too many, says Steve, he is the author of structural social exclusion. But that isn't all, I suspect. If we're honest, many of us can find Paul picky and pedantic, seemingly focused on creating rule after rule. We can perhaps at times hear a voice that seems to lack a bit of humility and grace, something that can add to this idea that Paul is somehow the author of an aggressively patriarchal sort of church. And of course, we can often find Paul really quite hard to understand, perhaps an impenetrable puzzle at times, something that even his contemporaries recognized, as I noticed for the first time only last week. Because the author of 2 Peter, either Peter himself, his scribe, or someone writing shortly after his death, writes that Paul's letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort as they do the other scriptures to their own destruction. Remarkably prophetic words when we think of how Paul's writings have been used in the 2,000 years since. So how can we respond to Paul given all these challenges? Well, we can be tempted to avoid those bits of our Bibles entirely, to focus more on the Gospels than on Paul's epistles. And I guess you probably won't be surprised to hear me say that I don't think that's the right answer. There is so much deep wisdom in Paul's writings that we should avoid the temptation of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But we do need to find some practical ways to engage better with Pauline theology, and I've come up with 3 suggestions that I hope can help. Firstly, we need, I think, to be prepared to grapple with different translations to overcome some of those issues of language and accessibility. The NIV and the NRSV are both relatively literal renderings of the epistles, resulting in, and this will chime in with those of us who read in church on a Sunday morning, those really long and cumbersome sentences that we find in a lot of Paul, and that flowery rhetorical style that doesn't help any of us to really fathom out what he's talking about. So unless you're a Greek scholar, and I know we have at least one of those in the congregation, I can suggest accessing different translations to eke out the meaning of a particular passage. And the Bible Gateway website is a great tool for that and for seeing different translations literally side by side on the screen. Secondly, I think it's important for us to look at the letter as a whole, as we did in our summer series on 1 Thessalonians. That can help us to understand the context, perhaps with the help of a good commentary, but also to see the full flow of the letter's argument. And a couple of great online resources for doing that are the Bible Project, which provides a really helpful and visual overview of each book in the Bible in about 10 minutes or less. It's a great way just to get that overall flow. And Bible for Life, which has a whole range of resources designed to help you engage with a whole book at a time. But thirdly and finally, it's important to try to distinguish between when Paul is writing systematic theology, theology that is relevant to Christians of all kinds, in all places and in all times, and when he is in fact writing specific advice for those particular new churches in Rome or Corinth or Ephesus. Paul's writing contains a huge amount of very specific advice for those new church plants, much of which was in response to the questions and concerns of those churches. We don't know precisely what those questions were, and we lack a complete understanding of the context, although good New Testament and historical scholarship is helping us to understand more literally every year. Again, as Steve Chalk suggests, Paul says different things to different churches in different situations at different times. So to decontextualize a specific point that he makes to a particular church, and then to try to turn it into a universal principle applicable at all times in all places to all people, is to make a dangerous error, no matter how many preachers endorse it. the more we feel that Paul is being specific in his advice to a particular church in a particular context, the more we should feel the freedom to interpret it more loosely. And particularly where it's at odds with either the rest of that book or the wider biblical canon, or indeed with our own lived Christian experience. And that's incredibly important because, as I've said, there is far too much life-enhancing wisdom in Paul's writings for us to hold our nose and simply turn away. And that is particularly true of this letter to the Romans, from which our first reading comes this morning. It was Paul's magnum opus, his letter to a divided church in Rome that he'd never visited, but where he knew that Gentile and Jewish Christians were at odds with each other. It's a book in which he lays out his understanding of the whole gospel message, and which is the culmination of 25 years of the most active ministry we can imagine. Not for nothing do many of history's greatest Christian thinkers, people like Augustine, Luther, John Wesley, Karl Barth, profess the huge influence of this letter on their theology. And of course, when we do have a good look at what Paul is saying in this passage from chapter 13, we see that his theology is much more open, much more expansive, and much more inclusive than we might typically give him credit for. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbour as yourself. So the Apostle Paul, perceived by so many as a bit miserable, pedantic, pernickety, misogynistic, a rule bringer, is actually focused more on principles than on rules. In the light of Jesus' life, his ministry, his death and resurrection, Paul expresses so clearly and simply that love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is enough. Love is the only lens that matters. Love trumps rules. And in that context, I suspect that Paul himself would exhort us not to rigidly follow the nitty-gritty of one side of a 2,000-year-old dialogue between him and a fledgling church that had some really very specific opportunities and challenges. I think he would find it profoundly odd for us to apply what he said to those individual churches to our deliberation about, say, the role of women in the church, or how we should respond to loving and faithful same-sex relationships, or any of the other thorny theological and ecclesiological issues that confront us. I think he would encourage us simply to apply the lens of love. Because as Paul is making very clear in this letter to the Roman church, if it isn't of love, if it doesn't look like love, if it doesn't feel like love, then it isn't of God and it isn't of Jesus Christ. Of course, that liberating and very principles-based approach to navigating both Scripture and our daily lives brings a lot more clarity to what is otherwise a really challenging gospel reading this morning from Matthew. In it, Jesus gives advice for his disciples about how to respond to sin and conflict within the emerging church. They're instructions that seem bafflingly and unrealistically simple if we consider the many things that Christians can disagree with in our churches today. But again, when we set aside the rules, the doctrine, the dogma, and focus instead on reconciling our differences through the lens of love, it all becomes a whole lot easier, and this passage makes a whole lot more sense. We can all argue about what Paul does or doesn't say about slavery, or the role of women in the church, or same-sex relationships. We've been doing that for the best part of 2,000 years. But I don't think we can argue for long when we put narrow and rigidly held rules to one side and simply apply love to the reconciliation of our differences. In the words of American pastor Joanne Lee, we're not called to be rule followers. We are called to experience and understand the deep love that undergirds and upholds the commandments of God. And by intimately being known and loved by our God, to then extend and share that love with the world. Breathtakingly simple. And yet for us flawed and mortal humans who find so much comfort in rules, so incredibly hard in practice. Amen.
Right, we have some notices, but you'll be relieved, not many. Top priority is to remember that love rules. Let's all carry Ian's word that he conveyed to us today as we go about, as we leave from here this morning and we go out into our everyday lives. Let's remember, love rules. And please, you will have noticed, no doubt, that we still don't have any doors. But don't worry, they will be here this week. Julie and I will be so relieved. A huge thank you to all the people who have opened and closed. It's not been an easy time. So thank you, and a big thank you to Julie, who's had to sort us out as well. And please hold in your prayers. We are starting Sparklers again tomorrow, our baby and toddler group. So do pray as we go forward into a new term. And also as we start our collective worship services at the schools as well this week. Dates for your diary. 17th of September, our church walks start again. There's info in the email update. If you haven't received that, please get in touch with Michael or Karen Crockett. And another date is Friday the 22nd of September. There will be a celebration service for the life of Mary Pace, and her family have invited everyone who knew Mary to please do come along and join them for that service. And please hold the family in prayer as we have Mary's funeral, private family funeral, tomorrow at 1:45, please. That's all the notices. Woohoo! Amazing.